Thanks so much, everybody, for coming, particular Sebastian Konrad. Many thanks for supporting our workshop today. Yeah, just quickly, we are at this point a rather small group, but I would say we are collectively seeking to push forward particular tendencies in Caucasian studies. And yeah, I think regarding the workshop, we have a couple of sessions, but before I go into detail regarding the workshop, I would like quickly to introduce Sebastian Konrad. Yeah, again, so many thanks for being here today. Yesterday evening, I prepared some of his publications, and yeah, frankly speaking, all of his monographs and articles and pioneering writings, it wouldn't have fit on a PowerPoint presentation. So, yeah, Sebastian Konrad is one of the leading German historians, in particular one of the most influential theorists behind the approach of global history. So we're so thankful that you're here today and presenting us today what is global history, what does it really mean, what are the current tendencies in this approach. Yeah, as Nino already mentioned, Sebastian Konrad is a professor at the Freie Universität in Berlin since 2010. From 2007 until 2010, he has been a professor at the European University Institute in Florence. He has also been a professor invité at the École des Études Anciennes Sociales in Paris, and also a member of the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. So yeah, we couldn't be more proud of having you here today, Professor Konrad. So as you see, most of his publications are dealing with global history. In particular, one of the main approaches what Professor Konrad did is that he put the German history in particular into a global perspective. All of his studies had been published: Cambridge University Press, Columbia, Beck Verlag, and Princeton University Press is his latest, but also Harvard University Press. I would like to circulate two of his studies. Latest studies, if you're interested in. So, yeah, without any further ado, Sebastian, the stage is yours. I think it's going to be kind of an introduction regarding current tendency in global history. What does it really mean? We have so many questions. It took us a couple of times to really understand what it means. I think there are different approaches how to understand it. There are pros and cons, but I think regarding our approach, regarding coming from Caucasian studies or Islamic studies, for example, it is such a fruitful and helpful methodological approach, and no one could be better to introduce us to this topic as Professor Konrad. So many, many thanks again for being here, and the stage is yours.
All right, good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me. It's been already a pleasure to be here since yesterday. I've learned a lot. I will learn much more. I see that we have a lot of interesting talks coming up. Oops. That was not a great start. So I'm going to be the one who's learning. In fact, I talked with Tillman about what to do today, and he said be introductory for the sake of the students. Now I understand that we're really here mostly among colleagues, so some of this may be too basic. We'll just raise your hand whenever it's too basic, and I'll skip over and move on. Let me briefly see whether this works now. It did work. No, it's not a big deal. I usually don't like standing behind a desk, and this allows me to move around the room. If it doesn't work, then I'll just stay here. Yeah. Anyway, so let's start this way. Or can I? Yeah, klar. We'll try that. Anyway, so I'll start before we. So really, the idea was to give a presentation, a general introduction into global history. Some of this may be all too familiar. Now, let's briefly start with this quote by Chris Bailey, the now late historian of India and also global history in Cambridge, who said that we're all global historians anyway, except for the fact that some of us haven't realized it yet. So one of the questions that we can ask is, to what extent, in what ways are we actually global historians, or should we? In fact, if you look around the world today of publishing, journal publications and so forth, you see that global history is really all over the place. We see journals emerging, handbooks emerging, not only in the Anglophone world, but also elsewhere. It's kind of difficult to see, but this is a Japanese introduction to global history that came out recently. So if we look at the world of publications, also the tendencies in some of the most renowned journals, we see that global history has taken over the stage. What, however, is not happening is that everyone has turned into a global historian. Here's a quick, this is from the country where I hail from, Germany, but the situation is very similar in many other, in particular, continental European countries. So if you actually look at the institutional setting, you'll see that still most historians deal with one country, in particular, their own. So this is just a quick glimpse into the German scene. You can see the blue, everyone, pretty much, most of the historians deal with Germany, just very few with other parts of the world. Mind you, the green, which is Europe, is mostly Eastern European studies, sort of a leftover really still from the Cold War period. So in some ways, you could say it's very difficult to turn into a historian in Germany unless you do German history. The same is true for France, the same is true for Italy. In many countries, it is a little different in the Anglophone world, even though this is a recent poll by the American Historical Association, and you can see that also in the US, the main focus continues to be on the Atlantic world. In most history departments, the historians of the US are the major force, and they deal with the US only. In other words, global history has some work to do. And if we sort of summarize it, I think in its most basic terms, I would say it's an attempt to move beyond two what I call birthmarks of the discipline as it emerged in the 19th century. In many ways, the conditions of emergence of that discipline have left traces that are still with us today. So these, just to run through them very quickly, first, history as it emerged was tightly linked to the nation state, both in terms of organization, both in terms of ideology, but also methodologically in the way in which history was the history of one state, and in particular one nation. Second, and of course there could also be empires in the case in which nation states had not yet emerged, but the idea essentially was that it was sort of a container view of history. The second aspect is the deeply ingrained Eurocentrism that is part of the emergence of the discipline of history in the 19th century. By the way, not only history. Essentially all of the modern disciplines in the social sciences, sociology, say, political science, emerged with a similar baggage. Now, the net result of all this is what I usually call internalist histories. That is, historians, but also social scientists, typically explain social change within one country or society. That is, the reasons, the causal factors that help explain social change are located within one society, as if in a box. Now, this is really more for the students. An example I sometimes give is imagine yourself being a student of chemistry, and this is what you would typically study. We would be very surprised if one of you said, well, this is what I'll do, right? I'll study just one element. And in fact, in some ways we could say this is what historians do. They have this is what is at their disposal, and then in Germany in particular, that's what they actually do. And imagine that it's enough to understand this very one place. Now, so this is briefly the menu, and we can, skip over parts that are maybe of less relevance. The idea would be to talk briefly about 3 features of global history that I think are characteristic. Second, then to answer Chris Bailey's initial question about how to be a global historian. And then if we have time, I would like to briefly look at other ways of thinking through world history that are out there, and to see to what extent global history is a different approach in that larger field. And then finally, we'll definitely have to talk about also the challenges and the limits, maybe the costs of going global, right? There's no approach that comes with benefits only. We know that from Thomas Kuhn and the whole discussion on paradigm shifts. Whenever we shift the framework, we're in a position to ask new questions and to give new answers, but we're also typically losing something. So let's briefly run through these. The first one is going to be very brief. Essentially, I want to make 3 points. Global history is an approach. The anti-Eurocentrism is a crucial part, and positionality plays a large role. Now, briefly to the first one, to say that global history is an approach may seem intuitively immediately plausible, and why not? But in fact, it's not what most people actually practice or think. So, for example, if you look at the web page of the World History Association, that also publishes the Journal of World History, this is how they define it. They say, put simply, world history is macro history. It's trans-regional, trans-cultural, and transnational. So global history, world history as macro history. And I would say, no. I mean, yes, of course it can be, but it doesn't have to be. In fact, some of the most interesting studies will be located at a micro level and try to link that micro level to larger questions. So essentially the point here would be that global history is an approach and not just the object of study. It's not the given reality that we just simply need to sort of decipher, but in fact it's a lens. I think it's primarily a heuristic that helps us put particular parts of the past in a new light, which also means, again, as just said, it does not necessarily mean that we need to go planetary. It's not the total coverage of the globe, but instead it's more a perspective that links a particular place to larger contexts, which also means that global history is one approach among potentially many. In that way, it resembles, say, gender history or cultural history and so forth. So it allows us to put a particular phenomenon in a new perspective, but it may not be it's definitely not the one and only approach. It may not even be the perfect approach for a particular question. It really depends on what we want to know, on the questions that we'll ask. So while in theory, I think pretty much every topic and also every period has the potential for a global history perspective, there will clearly be topics where other approaches will be more rewarding and more productive. And I think that's something to keep in mind and is important. The second feature I'll very briefly only allude to is to move beyond Eurocentrism is clearly one of the main agendas of global history. Now, we could talk about this for ages. I'll just briefly say that by this here I mean not only what we study, in other words, what are legitimate subjects and objects of study, may need to change. Second, also the narratives with which we study history, in particular when we tell the story of modern history and the emergence of modernity. That's typically a very Eurocentric narrative that is applied. And thirdly, this is a question also that involves the very concepts and the terminology that we use to understand the past, that typically, even in cases where we don't immediately realize it, carries a Eurocentric baggage with it. The third aspect that I just briefly want to highlight is positionality. I think that's a crucially important point. Let me see if I, no. So there are many historians out there who think that, you know, once we go global, we can actually arrive at sort of a, you know, one-fits-all kind of explanation of how the world changed. I mean, there are people, for example, championing this field of big history, I'll come to that in a second, who believe that once we move away and sort of look at the world as if we looked from the moon, then we can tell one objective story of the world, and that could be then told in every country, in every school, and on the long run, it will lead to global peace as well. I don't see that happening at all. In fact, I think it's crucially important to realize that that our understanding of what the world is or means depends on from where we actually write or look. It is a world history as written from Malaysia will be different as one written from Georgia, say, and it needs to be. In some ways, global history, I think, is sort of a conversation between different ways of looking at the world. There's an interesting study by Dominic Sachsenmeier that came out a few years ago where he studied, actually looked at, empirically, if you will, looked at the history, the world history writing in 3 different countries. He looked at the United States, at Germany, and China. And in this book, he very clearly shows how different not only the agenda is of doing global history in these countries, and of course it varies also within every one of those countries, but also how even the method, the institutional impact, what it means to do global history is different. So it's bound to be different wherever we look. So in other words, it also means that we need to hijack the approach for our own purposes wherever we are. Right, so let me then move into the second part, 3 ways of doing global history. Now this is really meant for students and is a bit, I'll briefly rush through that. Essentially, I will be saying that there are now, if we observe it, 3 broad strategies to do this, to do global history, and I'll briefly run through these 3 and start with the first one, what I call the all-in approach, which is essentially just another way of saying global is everything that happens on the planet, which is in itself already frequently a salutary perspective. So for example, when I was a student in Berlin, there was this other student who had taken a class on the slave trade, but he couldn't get credits for it because the history department, wired as it was in national history terms, said slavery is not part of German history. So if you do a seminar on slavery, it doesn't really tell us what the substance of the early modern period is about. So he didn't get credits for it. In fact, to move beyond this national framework is already in that sense salutary. Now there are now. So most people probably, if they hear global history, this is exactly what they would have in mind. Studies that cover the whole globe, be it of a, and this is one example, right? This is from a recent handbook that covers the field, where the 2 authors say, global history strictly understood is the history of what happens worldwide across the planet as a whole, as if viewed from a cosmic crow's nest, with the advantages of immense distance and panoptic range. Now, so we have two things here, right? Global history means covering everything, and second, the idea of a cosmic view, one that's impartial, that is not tainted by nationalism. Global history as moving beyond national history also implies moving beyond a nationalistic view of history. But of course, the result, I don't think, would be objectivity, but in fact, it will be a multiplicity of voices. So I don't subscribe to that view, but I think this is a very characteristic perspective. Now, global historians do all kinds of studies that range broadly, be it on a particular year, like this book on the year 1688, or one on 1800, or they range broader, covering whole centuries, like Chris Bailey in his magnificent, I think, study. It's great, even though Neil Ferguson says it's a masterpiece on the cover. Or the German response, you know, the German scholars like to. So Bailey's study was already a 500-page piece, but then Jürgen Osterhammel comes along and offers a 1,500-page response to that. So a full century. But there are many global historians who say no. I mean, even a century is not enough. Let's look at the whole stretch of the past millennium, as David Landis in this very Eurocentric rendering of world history. Or let's go even broader, Felipe Fernandez Armesto in a study of the world, a history that essentially starts with the arrival of humans on the planet and covers everything. Well, even that is not enough for the big historians like David Christian. I don't know to what extent this is an approach that's familiar with you. Essentially, the idea here being that history starts with not humans, but with the Big Bang, and we need to tell the story as it unfolds as of that beginning. In this book, the arrival of humans arrives rather late, and everything that most of us in this room would actually be willing to study is crammed into like the last chapter or so. Now, this is I think within the academy, this is not a very influential view. It is, however, you may know that one of the main adherents to this view, one of the fans of big history, is a character by the name of Bill Gates, who loves this approach and pours a lot of money into it with the idea of creating a global curriculum that then will be taught in schools worldwide. Now, this is total coverage. Of course, you can also say, let's just look at a particular theme or topic and then go global, the histories of, let's say, salt or sugar, histories of glass or empires of the Cold War, and so forth. So essentially, the all-in approach promises total coverage, be it on a particular theme or on everything. Now, most global historians these days would then say, well, that may not be enough. I think we need something more. It's not just, hitting on every country or region, but we need to actually foreground connectivity. Connectivity is the catchword. Connections, interactions, entanglements, there's a whole vocabulary now emerging that the global historians are using, and they say it's not global until it's connected and entangled. And then again, we have all kinds of topics and themes and approaches that really focus on these links, be it studies on migration or individual lives that are connected, and historians are busy uncovering the hidden links in biographies that until then didn't look so global. Obviously, trade is an important field here. All kinds of debates, or sort of on the level of discourse, we can find global links. And the net result is a world that is increasingly connecting, not only connecting in the sense that everyone's connected, but also in the way in which people are now using the metaphor of networks and nodes and so forth to look at various links across the world. So history as connectivity. Now, my point, however, would be, and this is a point I made in one of the books that is circulating, that featuring connectivity is not enough. It doesn't get us really anywhere, except for the interesting fact that there are these connections, which create sort of a surprise, but in themselves don't necessarily mean something, right? And therefore, I think we need to focus on what I call global integration. By that I mean, essentially mean that we need to ask ourselves to what extent whatever we study is linked to larger processes of integration that help explain or structure whatever we study. That is, we don't necessarily need to study this integration. It's in itself in every single project, but we should link whatever we look at to these larger patterned processes of change. And I have one example here that I think I'll briefly talk about that may illustrate what sounds very abstract until now. And this is, and the example is the emergence of the notion of Asia in Asia, and by that I mean East Asia. So my expertise, I So Tilman kindly introduced me, but when I started out, my first book was on Japan, so that's where my training is. I started out as a historian of East Asia, and that's also why this example now comes. Now, the term Asia in itself is something that we're used to now, but which is both a geopolitical and also conceptual innovation, even though it has a very long history. So already in Herodotus' work, we find the term Asia. But of course, that was a European perspective, and it arrived in East Asia only much later. So some of the ideas that I'll be referencing are derived from Rebecca Karl's book on Chinese nationalism that was published a decade and a half ago. Now, the term Asia arrived in East Asia only in the 16th century with a character by the name of Matteo Ricci, one of the Jesuits who worked for the Chinese court. But even then, it didn't really register. Matteo Ricci, he created a famous map that for the first time put the name of Asia to the continent in Asia. This was in the 16th century, but the term only really created, repercussions or acquired meaning in East Asia in the late 19th century. Only then did it actually hold social meaning for social actors. Now, here's an example from a Korean school book in the year 1895 that simply says, China, like our nation, is one country in the Asian continent. Now, this seems to be almost a sort of commonsensical remark, but it was a revolutionary remark in the way in which China was seen as part of Asia at this moment. How can we understand, what is specific or peculiar about this? Let's briefly look at and this is all, I hope, coming together now. Let's briefly look at the world tour of the Hawaiian King Kalakaua in the 1880s. This is King Kalakaua, who decided in 1881 to travel the world, look at the various countries of the world, and see what he can learn for Hawaii. So he made his way to Europe, the United States, Europe, arrived in Japan, and then finally arrived in China. And in China, he tells Li Hongzhang, the sort of main representative of the Chinese government, he says, "We are Asian," here again the term, "we are Asian as are you. And I've already warned the Japanese emperor, and now I'm warning you, if we were able to unite as Asians so as not to leave foreigners a single opening, would this not be the best way to arouse our brown Asian peoples? I eagerly await for this to happen." So Asian solidarity is needed in the face of foreign threat. Now, for Li Hongzhang, and here you see him with Bismarck, that's what he was, really looking at. He didn't even know that a place like Hawaii existed. In the morning, he was briefed by one of his aides that, yes, there in fact is such a place. But for him, Hawaii was the remotest corner of the world that was even imaginable. To put this schematically, sort of within the Chinese worldview still prevalent for someone like Li, the idea that the Chinese civilization emerged and sort of emanated out from a center and then gradually sort of, decreased by distance from Beijing. So the further you went away, the more distant the various tributary countries were from the core of Chinese civilization. This was the worldview that he was accustomed to. So from this perspective, Hawaii just simply didn't feature on his mental map. This was in 1881. It took another decade or so, and China lost the war to Japan in 1895. And after 1895, the main protagonists of reform in China, like, for example, the historian Liang Qichao, had to go into exile, leave the country. And where did Liang Qichao actually go? He started in Japan, but then ended up in Hawaii, of all places. And in Hawaii, it was that he realized that, in fact, China and Hawaii were in the same situation. Hawaii was just being annexed by the United States in 1898. And it was clear to him as anything that China awaited the same fate as did Hawaii. He also noticed, and this is the image on the right, that the various groups of Chinese workers who came to were hired by plantation owners in Hawaii to work in particular the sugar plantations. They hailed from various different backgrounds in China, didn't know each other, didn't speak each other's language, but were turned into Chinese in this diaspora situation. So both the idea of China being threatened as Hawaii, but also the idea of Chinese under these new conditions of global capitalism and migration being formed into Chinese is something that Hawaii actually drove home to him. Does this story make sense? So essentially the point I want to make is that the understanding of Asia here shifts from an understanding of Asia as culture / civilization to one of Asia as geopolitics. That is, the same kind of threat, right? The same kind of threat that that China and Hawaii face turns them into Asians. Not the fact that they both speak the same language, share the same culture, are both Confucian, which is clearly not the case. So, to put this differently, under the conditions of increasing global integration through empire and capitalism, there is now a realm for historical actors to use this space as one that they share and where the notion of Asia suddenly begins to make sense. That is something that I think we can only understand if we apply a global perspective that focuses on this notion of integration. All right. I'll move into, if that's okay with you. You can always interrupt me anytime. I'm happy to. Otherwise, I'll just move on and move into the third part of what I want to talk. And here I would just very briefly, also schematically, want to highlight the way in which global history is one way of thinking about how the world came together. And in some ways, it responds to and complements other approaches that are still, in many ways, very present, but influential, sometimes also very productive. Now, very briefly put, I'll start with the first one, which is sort of the most old-fashioned, but still probably in some ways, if you look at textbooks in particular, very influential, namely the idea that to think about the coming together of the world is to think about, in particular if we look at the modern period, the idea that there is a process of modernization that then diffuses around the world. There's one origin, and then a history of diffusion. Now, this is an old book that I've alluded to here, The Rise of the West, one of the iconic and classical studies in the field of world history from the 1960s. And nobody would use that term now, I think, on the cover of their books, but sort of as as a red thread that runs through the narratives, it's still very much present. Essentially the idea that Europe produces this transformation to modernity, which is then disseminated around the world. So, yes, this is the part for the students. Modernity as emerging in the West and then gradually diffusing elsewhere. Essentially a story of benevolent, rationalization, to use Max Weber's term. Now, as a response to this, we have post-colonial studies that was at least very influential, still is in many parts, that essentially says, no, this is not as simple as that. It's not a story of, if we call it a story of rationalization, it's already an ideological perspective. In fact, the imposition of modernity is something that came with a lot of violence and even atrocities. It is a form of imperialism on all levels, including a form of cultural imperialism. So if we looked at the same kind of picture, we would still say that yes, many parts of modernity emerged in the West, wherever that exactly was, but it's not so much a simple question of diffusion, but of colonialism, of imposition, of annihilation of alternatives, which is characteristic for this story. So world history / diffusionism versus post-colonial studies. And there is a third, I think, narrative that in some ways competes with these other two. That's the story of multiple modernities that had its heyday, I would say, at the turn of the century, but is still also among students, I find, a very attractive model. Now, essentially the argument of multiple modernities would be to say, no, these other two narratives both place the origin of dramatic transformations in the West. That is a misunderstanding. In fact, there are dynamics that happen within many societies that go back to cultural resources and legacies within these societies that are not simply informed and influenced by the West, but essentially we have sort of stories of autonomous, if you will, but in many ways self-driven social change in various countries, civilizations, empires. And the idea being that that there is the power for change, which is obviously true, I think, and there is historical dynamism in many societies, and it would be a simplification to see this as essentially energized by the West. Now that is, I think, again, a very healthy move, as the post-colonial move was, but what it does is it effaces or it marginalizes interactions that are so characteristic of the modern world. So the approach of multiple modernities assumes that there is, we can almost tell individual, pillarized stories that to some extent lead to a similar result. And that's why I think the notion of global history is helpful, because it is able to accommodate some of the insights of these other approaches, but has the potential to move beyond that and to understand global change as really driven globally. And again, I have a rather clumsy visualization of this, but essentially saying that if we look at these various places that are so neatly separated, we cannot say that there is an origin somewhere and effects elsewhere, but in fact we have to look at this whole story as one that's deeply implicated and a story of interconnectivity. So a place like France is in many ways structured by, this large circle, the idea being that it indicates sort of structural change on a global level that informs even the emergence of a place like France, but then is also influenced by whatever happens in France. And we see, well, interrelationships between various parts. So we need to think of this as a field that's deeply structured by processes that go beyond particular places. All right. Now I would, so while this first part of the talk, or these first three parts, were essentially presented, let's call it in a missionary vein, because I think it's also in many ways, at least for me myself, may I say that in this way, it was an emancipatory approach that helped me to think along lines that moved away from the fetters and the shackles of national history as it was practiced and still is practiced in the universities of many parts of the world, but definitely where I come from. There are also costs and challenges, at least, that we need to think about. Could you just let me know time-wise how much time should I take for the final part? Well, I'm not sure if that's agreed. So anyway, I'll briefly highlight maybe 5 or 6 of these challenges that that can be seen as productive, but also seen as limiting. So the first one is this here. Global history frequently highlights synchronicity. I think that's an interesting feature, and in some ways sort of goes counter to what historians are usually used to. So historians like, to link the past with the present. They like to draw, to sketch scenarios of path dependency. They like the idea of the longue durée, or of continuities, of change over time. That's maybe the quickest definition of what a historian actually does, to look at change over time. Now, the global turn will typically complement this by a focus on synchronicity. We're all familiar, let's say, by the age of the Arab Spring, that situations that happen simultaneously may influence each other and may be more important as factors than the internal history in each and one of those places. There's by now, I think, classic study in the field of global history that makes a similar argument. Many of you may be familiar with this book by Aris Manela, who essentially argues that in 1919 we see the simultaneous emergence of national uprisings, national revolts, national revolutions in a number of places, ranging from Korea, where on March 1st, thousands of Koreans take to the street to rebel against Japanese rule, to just a few weeks later in Egypt in the spring of 1919, where on by now iconic sites like Tahrir Square, Egyptians rebel against British rule and campaign for national independence, to Amritsar in South Asia, where the British conduct and engineer a massacre. Now, this is not historical footage here. I have to acknowledge that this is from the movie Gandhi, the image on the right, to Beijing, where the May 4th movement in the spring 1919 is probably the most important instance of the history of nationalism in China. Now, all these movements are very well known. They have generated libraries of scholarly studies on each single one of them. But what no one has really looked at is, why is it the case that all of these happen pretty much at the same moment, pretty much simultaneously? And the argument that Manela gives is that he essentially claims that, the reason is that they respond to the same challenge, the challenge being the end of World War I, the reconfiguration of geopolitics at that moment, and in his reading, the crucial intervention of Wilson, namely the promise of self-determination, that Wilson didn't even imply for the whole of the world, but essentially had Eastern Europe in mind, but nevertheless resonated with social actors, with nationalists around the world. So, for example, on this image here that you see, we have, we can read, if we can, the world made safe for democracy, but also on these Chinese images, you can see Confucian characters used to transliterate or translate even the term self-determination. So this idea of, so this Wilsonian idea, that's the claim that Aris Manela makes, is one of the reasons that helps us explain the simultaneity of these events. It helps us explain that they break out pretty much at the same time, even though, as he argues, there's no real links between them, right? They happen in some ways independently of each other, but clearly not independently if you look at the larger context. So in that respect, a typical move of global historians will be to say, let's not just simply look at long continuities of time within a particular society, but in fact, let's look at moments of synchronicity in space and see to what extent they can actually also work as global, as factors, as causal factors of change. Now, why do I put this here under challenge? Because if we look, I'll just go back a few slides. If we look at the subtitle of Manela's book, the international origins of anti-colonial nationalism, then we can already see that this is maybe going a step too far, right? Let's take just any of those examples. Let's take the example of India, where it was already in 1885 that the National Congress was formed, and it certainly didn't require Wilson to come along to create anti-colonial nationalism in South Asia. The same being true for the other cases as well. So there is a certain tendency. There's at least a potential danger of subsuming all these stories under global impact, which is then producing a skewed image, which is, I think, already obvious here in this example. So in other words, while it is, I think, heuristically very useful to look at this idea of simultaneity, we at the same time need to be aware that there are local factors and sort of long-term developments that we should not ignore. The second problem here is so going beyond Eurocentrism, I think, remains a crucial aspect of the global history agenda, but what it there is a tendency sometimes to sort of blend into or produce and lead to situations where Eurocentrism is replaced by other centrisms instead. So, and this is an almost silly example, a book that I will not recommend and nobody probably has read, I hope at least, a book by Gavin Menzies, who was this book was a national bestseller in the United States a few years ago, essentially making the following claim. It says, 1421, it's not 1492 that the modern world begins. It's not Columbus discovering the Americas, but in fact, I can show, he argues, that China discovered the world already half a century earlier. Now, going back to the well-known large expeditions by Zhang He, the Chinese admiral, he argues that in fact now we have evidence that they reached California in 1421. Now, this is a sort of a way in which a Eurocentric story, namely the modern world begins with Columbus discovering the Americas, is sort of turned around into, no, it's actually China that discovers America, and therefore, we need to rewrite world history. In fact, Gavin Menzies, after the success of this book, wrote a sequel that was called 1436 or some such, where it is then the Chinese that arrive in Tuscany, Italy, and spark the Renaissance. So it's not only the discovery of the Americas, but it's also the Renaissance. So now the ironic thing, of course, here is that the whole Eurocentric story, namely modernity, equals the discovery of the Americas and the Renaissance, is firmly in place. There's no change to that, but just the players are reversed, right? So we still stick to the same story. But we could, so if we have had more time, we could, so that's just sort of a silly example. But there are, even if we just remain in China for a second, there's now a strong movement to turn Eurocentrism around, and by this I mean really change the story. That is, on most campuses of the most prominent Chinese universities, you now have faculties for history, political science, sociology, sort of the Western disciplinary canon, but you will also have a particular faculty for Chinese studies. The idea being that we need to, that one can recover forms of knowledge before the arrival of the West, before modernity, and go back to them and read the world through these particular perspectives, which would really be a challenge to Eurocentric narratives. But I think we see something emerging in many places. There are sort of new forms of centrism in Africa, in India in particular, with the current government, in Latin America, and so forth. So there is a certain, I think, danger that by moving beyond Eurocentrism, we introduce all kinds of other centrisms instead that are, that are not in any way better. Third, there's clearly a tendency with global historians to fetishize mobility. Now, that in itself, to focus on mobility in itself is obviously not a bad thing, but to rewrite the history as if it was only mobility that held it together is, of course, a problem. In many ways, I mean, there's now, you could probably, for pretty much every seafarer, you have a study these days, but peasants are no longer a legitimate object for global historians. There's a tendency sort of to marginalize the sedentary part of the population and to highlight mobility. So that, I think, is definitely also something that can come as a cost of the new approach. Three more things that I want to briefly, three more aspects. One is global history, I started out by saying national history as we knew it was the product of the emergence of the nation state in the 19th century and came with a baggage of nationalism. In some ways, national history was an instrument, a tool, was the ideology of the nation state in the 19th century. And we're gradually trying to sort of move beyond that, but are we not reintroducing the same kind of ideology, but now one of globalization? And in fact, you could easily say that, if you look at just the rhetoric or the language that global historians use, it's the language that also transnational corporations use. So what is it with the flow and the mobility and the entanglements, if not creating a view of the world that seems to make natural what some governments and some multinational corporations are actually creating out there in the world? So that's, I think, an important challenge, or at least it is something that we need to sort of keep in mind critically, that there may actually be this tendency. Now, my personal claim would be to say that this is not a given. The global history as an approach, not as a practice, but as an approach, is ideologically neutral and can be used for all kinds of purposes. And I think many of the, my colleagues out there who also subscribe to that paradigm, they would see themselves as writing, for example, the transnational history of anti-colonial resistance. So not separate histories of anti-colonial resistance in many places, but actually the ways in which they interacted and in some ways worked in tandem. So that would be one, or the transnational history of social movements. In other words, I think there are various agendas that we can link to this, but at the same time there is clearly also that potential. Two more points, and I'm already almost done. So the term global, that may also be something that we want to discuss further in the Q&A, but the term global is, for me, is a heuristic. As I said early on, I don't see it as signifying planetary or a totality, but of course it is a term that's used throughout. I've used it a lot today, and it is a term that can be very misleading. Obviously, if everything is global, then the term loses its specificity. So let's say if the Mongol Empire is global, and then the British Empire is global, and the whatever the committee for the Olympic Games is global, what is the specificity of the term if we can use it in so many different ways? That is clearly a problem. What I see in the future would be a situation where we practice all that I preached, but we can actually get rid of the term global. We'll just do good history, period. That, I think, is what will happen. But I think as a heuristic, it's good to keep in mind that the term global has this problem, in particular if it's linked to the ization formulation, right? If it's history of the world as the history of globalization. In other words, the idea that there is a continuous history that moves from less to more. Just as in the old days when modernization theory suggested that we move from tradition to modernity, one may be tempted to think that in global history we move from less connection to ever more, and that would be a crucial fallacy. In fact, there are now a range of interesting books that show us that, for example, this book by my colleague Valeska Huber, who writes on the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is one of the crucial moments of international and global connectivity. But what she shows very nicely in this book is that, yes, the Suez Canal enabled new connections and faster connections, in particular between let's say the city of London and the various possessions of the British Empire in Asia. But at the same time, it also interrupted connections in the region that had been in place for a long time. In other words, it's more a reconfiguration than just a simple from less to more. A reconfiguration of connections. In fact, the very idea of interconnections just increasing is misleading. In most cases, they cut off other connections. Like also the title of this book very beautifully illustrates, it's a study of Sri Lanka, and the claim of the author is that the British Empire, yes, did incorporate Sri Lanka into the connections within the British Empire, but at the same time, it cut off connections, in particular across the Indian Ocean, that had been in place for centuries. In that respect, this is the title, Sri Lanka was not globalized so much as it was islanded. And I think that's a productive way to think about such processes. It's not incorporation into something global as much as a transformation in the ways in which, and also of just the mere geographies in which places are linked and connected. I come to my final point, which is that apart from, let's say, the geographical dimension, there's also a way in which global history may, if not done well, flatten the way in which we tell our stories. And that's also something that we definitely don't want. And by this I mean, I brought a quote from a literary scholar by the name of Sanjay Krishnan, and maybe this helps us, to move into this discussion. So he says, in recent discussions of globalization, the adjective global is tacitly assumed to refer to an empirical process that takes place out there in the world. In contrast, I argue that the global describes a mode of thematization, or a way of bringing the world into view. It does not point to the world as such, but at the conditions and effects attendant upon institutionally validated modes of making legible within a single frame the diverse terrains and peoples of the world. Now let's say this in simpler terms. Essentially, the argument being that the global produces a language or provides a language that helps us link various places that are maybe not entirely, that may be entirely unconnected, puts them sort of on the same conceptual plane, and then through doing that makes them legible, that's his case, makes them accessible to us. But at the same time, they tend to then flatten the differences, the specificities. So whenever, for example, we say, for example, in the Japanese case, whenever Japan scholars would say daimyo, now the global historians need to say lords to make that compatible with other places. Now, what does that do to our understanding of Japanese history if we use these terms? What does it do if we use terms like religion to look at all kinds of practices in various places, but in our quest for a language that makes various places, compatible, we may then also write out and efface the specificities of these places. Now, this is not something that's peculiar for global historians. In some ways, this is whenever we apply a language of social science or aggregate terms to any place and try to understand it. So in some ways, it is a problem that we're familiar with all along. But I do think that in the context of going global, it poses itself with a specific urgency. It's something that comes to the fore with much more force. So whenever, and this is the final example, so for example, an interesting field where something like that happens is the field of empire studies. There's a very interesting book. My students, at least, they're all always very much provoked by when we read this in a history of empire that talks about the Comanche Empire. The Comanches that in the Great Plains, up until the 1840s and 1850s, created, as this author claims, their own empire. That was in many ways more powerful than the Spanish or the US empire at the time. Now, the way in which he uses the term empire allows to discuss the Comanche on the same level and on the same plane as the Spanish or the British or the French Empire, and that is one of the intentions. At the same time, he feels compelled to impose a whole language of foreign policy and capital, and that are very difficult to sort of bring together with the specificities of this social formation. So yes, the global turn enables us, I think, and makes possible conversations between places that so far had been studied in isolation, and that's a great thing. At the same time, there is a certain danger, and I think we need to be aware of that and reflect it throughout, that we may also marginalize some of the things that make these places interesting in the first place. All right, thanks a lot for bearing with me for all this time.